Hello, everyone, and welcome to the MMA Island podcast. I am Jack Kennedy alongside Hunter Boss, and today we have a very stacked podcast. We've had a couple technical difficulty stuff over here. We'll see if Keelan joins on in a little bit, but for right now, it is just us. Obviously, Hunter, thank you so much for coming on. Hunter is a writer for MMA Island, does some great work over at the website, MMAisland.net. Go check out that work. And obviously, he came on our Instagram live thing we did for Connor versus Dustin. So, Hunter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Jack Kennedy, and they hit a lot harder, in my opinion, too.
Mace Martinez, I don't think that's going to happen because those are two of the hottest divisions in the UFC right now.
I'm Keelan McNamara. He is here to stay, and I see him being a huge problem.
And this is the MMA Island podcast.
All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. And a bit of a spontaneous thing here, but we just got some breaking news that Khamzat Chimaev is retiring. This is probably due to COVID complications and stuff. It's really heartbreaking news. So, Hunter, what do you make of all of this?
You know, it's just honestly insane things that have happened. Like in this past few months, you know, he was supposed to be fighting the number 4 contender welterweight division, Leon Edwards, and fight got canceled due to COVID because Khamzat Chimaev, and then fight got rescheduled and canceled yet again due to COVID reasons. And you know, training through COVID is something crazy. You know, it's not a great feeling, as explained by Cody Garbrandt on the Joe Rogan Experience. It's just honestly, it's heartbreaking because he really had a future in this sport.
Yeah. I mean, it's there's not much to say. It's so disappointing, but like overall, and this is the only thing that we can really say is just we wish the best for Khamzat Chimaev. We want him to fully recover. We saw the terrible thing he put on a story where he's like coughing up blood and stuff. It's really difficult to see, you don't want to see that for anybody, especially with the whole COVID thing. It's very tough. So we wish for the best for him. And even though he only had a 3-fight UFC career, he definitely made the most of it. So eventually, if he is able to come back, we would love to see him back in the UFC. But for right now, just heal up.
Right.
All right. So let's go ahead and move on to our next topic. We had a great fight night this past week. Some good fights. Magomed Ankalaev versus Nikita Krylov was the co-main event. Hunter, what are you thinking about this great co-main event?
Co-main event was very good fight. You know, one of the better fights on this card. It was back and forth, pretty close up until the last round, where Ankalaev really dominated and showed his improved striking ability and even some wrestling near the end of it, being able to pin him down. But once again, it was a fantastic fight in the co-main event.
Yeah. Keelan, what do you think about this one?
Yeah, I agree with everything Hunter's just said. I think he summarized it really, really well. Very back and forward main event. Ankalaev looked excellent. Thought he just looked solid all around. His striking, I thought, was actually better than his last fight. He looked really solid when the pressure was taken to him. Very good at back and forth. His chin got tested a couple of times from what I remember, and he held on really well. So I think Ankalaev looked really, really decent, and he took his opportunity being in a co-main event spot, and it's on to bigger and better things for Ankalaev, no doubt at all.
Yeah, I completely agree. It was a great scrap. I was very interested in how Ankalaev was going to come into this fight, obviously with the crazy war he just had with Ion Cutelaba 2 times, basically. And obviously he really finished him the last time. And I was wondering how he was going to carry himself coming into this fight, especially against a really underrated guy, in my opinion, Krylov. And I think Krylov really proved it. He won that first round, in my opinion. He really put the pace on him. And then for Magomed Ankalaev to come back and win the next 2 rounds decisively, very impressive for me. And I'm glad to see him, and he's going to make a run, I think, in this division. A very interesting prospect and a guy that has not only heavy hands, but a strong fight IQ to back it as well. So definitely a contender to watch in the light heavyweight division. Yeah. All right. So let's go ahead and move on. And maybe a bit of a lackluster heavyweight main event, but nonetheless, the implications were massive Jairzinho Rosenstruck versus Cyril Gahn. Keelan, what do you think about this heavyweight main event?
I actually thought this was I thought this was a surprisingly impressive main event. I don't understand where the hatred's coming from for Cyril Gain. You know, for quite a few years now, even though we all love heavy-handed knockouts, and Derek Lewis is one of the best guys for that. You guys know how much I love him. I was actually very excited to see a technically precise kickboxer in there in Cyril
Yeah.
Gain. He brings a French kickboxing style called savate. Those who don't know, do check it out. It's very exciting to watch. And I thought he was very good against a dangerous guy like Jairzinho Rosenstrike. He came out in the first round, took some heavy hands from Rosenstrike. We kind of knew that was going to happen at some point, especially getting tied up in the middle of the octagon. I thought he took Rosenstrike's shots really well. I thought he managed distance excellently. I thought his jab was absolutely incredible. He landed, I think it was an orthodox jab, and you could hear it crack off Rosenstrike's face. And that was just incredibly impressive to me. I think he used his wrestling brilliantly. I don't think anybody's given that enough attention at all. And especially in the first round, there was an exchange against the fence, and he showed excellent positioning and movement to drag Rosenstruik to the right and then immediately switch to the left and land the takedown. I thought that was very, very impressive. And for pretty much for the rest of the rounds, he just coasted. I think Rosenstruik came into this looking for an early knockout. And I think not only did he not get it, but when he saw how tough Cyril Gain actually was, I think it hurt his spirit a little bit because he didn't throw as much as he should have after that. I really did think this fight was here for the taking for Rosenstruik, especially landing early. But massive credit to Cyril Gain. I mean, I know Dana's come out and he said he won, but we'll leave it at that. I think people need to give more credit to Gain's striking. I thought it was crisp. I thought it was precise. He hit and didn't get hit much. I'm utterly flabbergasted to understand the disliking that Cyril Gain's receiving here. I think there's a bit of a negative attitude towards heavyweights, especially. I remember last weekend Curtis Blades referred to it, obviously, with his wrestling style and how people, especially casual fans, would hate fighters who go in with precise fighting and use their wrestling or their kickboxing to hit and not get hit. This is something we should be celebrating. I mean, Gain showed real flair and skill in that ring, or in that octagon, sorry. He showed real generalship, and I thought he managed the fight fantastically. And quite frankly, where Cyril Gain goes from here, he's going to be a problem for his competitors, no doubt at all.
Yeah. Hunter, what do you think about this one?
Yeah, no, I 100% agreed. When you see 50-45s happening, you can't really blame the guy who got the 50, I'd say. I think Jairzinho was kind of looking for just a one-punch knockout throughout the entire fight, hoping he'd get it. Kind of maybe like the Alistair Overeem type of situation happening. He waited for quite some time, just waiting for that opening. But I feel like Cyril did a fantastic job frustrating Jairzinho, breaking his spirit. Every time he would go in, try to land a heavy shot, he would tie him up and push him against the cage. And from the outside, Cyril would have that amazing jab, cracking him and really hurting him with those shots. Like, you could see the damage he was wearing every time he got hit. Those leg kicks were also a really big factor. I feel like Jairzinho was really slowing down towards the end of the fight. That could have just been a gas tank from, heavyweight fighter. But once again, Cyril Gain is just a trouble in this division. I feel like he's gonna really be shining for quite some time. Even though Dana has a negative opinion towards what happened in that fight, I feel like there was nothing to blame for Cyril in that fight. If anything, it was Rosenstruik's fault.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, he fought the perfect fight for him. He used all of his strengths. He was a taller, longer guy, and he used that. He just fought perfectly. Rosenstruik, it's tough because he is known for just knocking guys out. So that's the part that, like, everybody going into heavyweight main event wants to see what we just saw last weekend with Derek Lewis and Curtis Blades, where someone's just out cold. But you have to appreciate the pure dominance that we just saw from Cyril Gahn. I mean, he looked so good. Very, very good on the feet, and he's going to be a real contender. But what Keelan mentioned and what Hunter alluded to as well is his grappling is very good as well. He mixes that in. That's what really makes him a dangerous contender in the heavyweight division. So yeah, Rosenstruck for me, he didn't look necessarily gun shy going into it. I think it was more that he was so mesmerized by the style of Gon that he was forced to not really go in. And if you expect just an all-out brawl, name one fighter other than Francis Ngannou that wants to just run in and throw bombs against Jairzinho Rosenstruck. No one wants to do that because you'll get knocked out cold. Um, there's only a couple people that can match that power, Derek Lewis and Francis Ngannou. Other than that, I don't think anybody can match that power on planet Earth. So I don't blame him at all. He fought a good fight. Rosenstruck really needs to go into it with a more balanced game plan. Really, he needed to expect Cyril Gane not to just run in there every single time. And another thing that was interesting too, those leg kicks, and we saw that was a theme the entire night. Those leg kicks, especially coming from a heavyweight, he was really doing a good job hiding them, but I know that was affecting his movement as well. Overall, just a great fight, a great game plan by Cyril Gane, and I'd like to see him match up against Volkov next. I think that would be a good technical striking matchup. And for Rosenstruck, he's still going to be there, but just needs to get a more balanced game plan for his next fight.
Yeah, I fully agree with everything you said, Jack. I actually think you summarized it excellently for sure. I think Cyril Gane's going to be a real slapped on problem at heavyweight. And the reason I think it is this: consider the fight we've just seen against Rosenstrike, and consider a heavyweight dominating and controlling distance and doing damage from the jab and the hook as soon as he goes in. Who's the only other fighter we know who can do that? And who's the only other fighter in this current crop we've seen that? The champion Stipe Miocic. Now, granted, Stipe has probably got much better wrestling, and he has that as an additional cannon in his artillery. But Cyril Gane could be the next Stipe Miocic if he can improve his wrestling. You know, even guys like Francis Ngannou, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, especially his power. I've alluded to that on many occasions. You know, none of these other guys outside of Miocic can actually control a fight at heavyweight. Cyril Gane's shown that he can, and he can do it very well. So a lot of these guys who are used to hitting and hoping might be in real trouble if they're fighting someone like Cyril Gane. And Alexander Volkov could be in the same boat potentially when they fight, because Volkov looked fantastic against Overeem. We covered that a few weeks ago, and I still stand by that fully. But Cyril Gane could manage this fight very, very well, assuming that is most likely his next opponent. So, yeah, I think Gane's going to be very, very slapped on and underappreciated, a bit like Stipe in the early years of his heavyweight career. Because heavyweight has such the reputation we've just talked about of guys getting knocked out cold in the first round, technical heavyweights like Stipe and Cyril Gane are not going to be appreciated, I don't think, for another couple of years. And I certainly think Gane's on the right path. I actually think he's the guy to watch in the picture at heavyweights. Mark my words.
Right now, I 100% agree with this too. We take a look at heavyweights, we think of cold knockouts, we think of punching, striking on whatnot. We don't see a whole lot of wrestling in that division anymore. We saw Daniel Cormier was doing it fantastically, but he retired. Stipe does it against Francis Ngannou and whatnot. But this time now that Gane is in the picture, we're going to see some really technical wrestling coming from his end as well as striking. You know, his footwork was immaculate in his fight. Yep. But we got to look at his wrestling as well, because I feel like a lot of heavyweights don't know how to prepare against a wrestler other than like Stipe and Alistair Overeem and a few like really high names. But the fight against Volkov would be a very interesting fight, because I feel like Cyril Gane would not be used to not having the reach advantage or the height advantage going against him. Volkov's going to present some real good issues, and Volkov has looked the strongest he's ever been before. You know, his punches cracking into Alistair Overeem were insane. It was just jabs were on nearly making him fall to the ground. But really, Cyril Gane is going to be a problem for this heavyweight division.
Definitely. I think that's an excellent point, Hunter, especially the footwork. No one has picked that up or given Cyril Gane credit for that in the mainstream media. And I think they're making a big mistake leaving that out, actually. So credit to you, Hunter. That's an excellent point. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, there's not much to add on to that. Just really exciting contender. You guys said it perfectly. All right, so our next segment today, obviously UFC 259 is right around the corner. So excited, a great main card, and we will be talking about keys to victory for the main event. Jan Blachowicz versus Israel Adesanya. So starting with Keelan, what are some of your keys to victory for both Jan and Izzy in this fight?
Man, I feel really, really sorry for Jan Blachowicz. I really do. I mean, he's just such a good guy. He's such a class stand-up fighter. You know, he's reached the mountaintop. He's reached the pinnacle of UFC gold, and his first light heavyweight defense is against Israel Adesanya. You really can't draw much of a worse straw than that outside of John Jones. Um, in terms of keys to victory, I think I'll cover the most obvious one first in Israel Adesanya. You know, it's really funny when one thinks back to it. Prior to the Derek Brunson fight, we criticized Adesanya for, well, we didn't, but Brunson did. He criticized Adesanya for being too skinny for a middleweight, and he's ended up pretty much slicing everybody up
Yeah.
since. And then, of course, Adesanya came out after the fight and said that he might be skinny, but his bones are like katanas and they will cut you up. And how prophetic has that proven to been? I think Adesanya is going to bring that up to 205, and I think he's going to be a nightmare for anybody that he faces. You know, as we've said, well, as I've said over the last couple of weeks, Eugene Berman, of course, Adesanya's coach at City Kickboxing, has said that he's going up to around the 197, 198 mark and letting his skill carry the rest, which is a very interesting tactic on its own. In terms of the keys for Adesanya, the keys are the keys that he's used in every other fight before. His fundamentals are what will win him this fight. You know, using that distance, managing range excellently. I have a feeling Jan's going to come forward and try and land something early. Long as he can counter punch as good as he's always done, he will hurt Blachowicz and he will start to cut him up. It's not just his punches, which we know are amazing anyway, but it's the elbows and the knees and the kicks and the calf legs. You know, he's like a one-man sort of arsenal. He's almost like light heavyweight now's Valentina Shevchenko.
Yeah.
He can hit you from anywhere. And Blachowicz has got to be so careful about this, and he has to be careful running in against Adesanya because Adesanya can manage range and pick you off. He can counter punch. He can do anything and everything. He showed that against Robert Whittaker, probably his best example. So Adesanya's keys are going to be his footwork and his speed. He's going to look to get in and get out and do damage while he's in, but not hang around for Blachowicz to be there to counter. And as long as he can do that, I do think this is Adesanya's fight to lose. He's got the speed advantage. He gives up size and reach, but his skill is almost unmatched in the feet by anyone in nearly any division. As for Jan, his key, no one has laid out a blueprint for how to beat Israel Adesanya. He is the unsolved mystery as of yet. The only indication we've ever gotten is actually from Yoel Romero, which was, of course, one of the worst title fights we've ever seen. But what Yoel did show was if you crack Adesanya hard and early, he does not want to mix it up with you. And Yoel did manage to land, I believe it was an overhand left, I think in the first fight.
Yep.
And Adesanya was for the hills. He didn't want none of the power. And going up to 205, as we have said, the equations there, power travels in proportion to division weight. And Jan Blachowicz carries, his arms are pretty much like steel hammers when they hit you. He showed that against Dominic Reyes. So Blachowicz's key is, unfortunately, the longer this fight goes on, the longer it favors Adesanya. I feel just because Adesanya will accumulate damage the longer the fight goes on. But if Blachowicz can get in early, get through Adesanya's counter punches, land one or two hard shots early, he could rattle Izzy. You know, Adesanya's shown he has a mind of steel when it comes to his opponents, but he does not like taking power. And if Adesanya takes a couple of good digs from Blachowicz, his chin might even start to go. So that's going to be Blachowicz's key to retaining his title. He has to get in early and land something hard fast, preferably within the first couple of minutes of the fight. He's got to get Izzy unsettled in there, and he's got to get Adesanya looking for where to go, because the longer this first round or two goes on, the more acclimatized and comfortable Izzy's going to get, and the more free-flowing he will just become. So that's Blachowicz's key. He's got to get in early, do damage early, and build on from there.
Yeah, Hunter, what are you thinking?
Yeah, no, you summarized it very well. I feel like Jan is very good in the clinch. So I mean, as soon as he clenches up his fighters, and as soon as he breaks the clinch, we've seen 2 or 3 knockouts just from the breaking of the clinch from Jan's point of view. So I feel like if he can tie up Izzy for a little bit, hold him against the cage, wear him down a bit. I mean, Izzy hasn't experienced his light heavyweight MMA experience yet. You know, I mean, he's moved up weight divisions in boxing when he had a little amateur boxing career, and also in kickboxing, he moved to the light heavyweight division in there as well. So he's experienced different strengths when it comes to punching, but has he experienced them when it comes to wrestling and grappling? I feel like this is going to be a very key part in the game plan of Jan. I feel Jan's wrestling has been really underrated too. I mean, we take a look at his last 4 wins; they've been by knockout. But if we take a look even before that, they've been standing rear naked chokes. We've seen head arm chokes. We've seen a pretty good arsenal that Jan has too. It's just, I feel like when we take a look at Jan, we kind of overlook him because of Izzy's record and his style of fighting. But Jan is as hard as they come when it comes to the fighter. But keys for success for Jan, once again, it's going to be kind of clenching him up. I feel like pushing him against the cage, trying to wear him down. Izzy has a great gas tank, and it's gonna get even better because he's been in these breathing camps he's been talking about, and is managing his cardio and whatnot, running on the beaches and crazy shots we've seen from the embedded episodes. And we take a look at Jan on the other hand. When he gets into the later rounds, he slows down. We've seen it in the Jakar Souza fight. We've seen him in plenty of other fights as well. Keys to success, once again, we take a look at his short hooks. They're very strong, and they pack a real big punch. It's one of Jan's best tools. We've seen a knockout Luke Rockhold, Dominic Reyes, you name it, he's done it. Corey Anderson, lots of different knockouts from on his end over here. Izzy, on the other hand, he's going to have to keep on the outside of this fight. I mean, Izzy has fantastic striking knowledge when he's inside the pocket with his opponents too. We see him inside head kicks and inside knees, and all, even stretching back to his kickboxing career, his knees were one of the biggest, baddest things we could see from a fighter. He would knee the body. They would literally go down from body shots, head shots, everything like that. I feel like Izzy can do a fantastic job, though, if he just keeps his distance. I know he's going to want to go in the pocket and strike with Jan just to prove himself, because we've seen him get emotional in fights. But I feel like if he really stays smart and keeps on the outside, he can have this fight any way he wants it. Jan, on the other hand, he's really going to have to push the pace with Izzy. He's going to have to, in those early rounds, I only see it finishing in the early rounds for Jan. I feel like if he goes to the later rounds, Izzy has the obvious advantage here. But once again, I feel like Izzy's going to have a real big problem against these light heavyweights. I feel like he's not going to be able to know how to wrestle as well as he could have in the middleweight division. I know his takedown defense is fantastic in the middleweight division, but this is a whole new division with whole new strength and power that he probably hasn't felt in quite some time. And it's just going to be a fantastic fight all around. So keeping the range for Izzy and staying in close for Jan. Those are the keys to success.
Yeah, that has to be it, right? I mean, Jan has to close the distance, and Izzy has to keep the distance. Really, I think the biggest factor is the kicks. Israel Adesanya's kicks are so tough to deal with. The one he landed versus Derek Brunson was incredible. It was kind of like a half question mark kick where he threw it up and then changed direction. It was incredible, and he's really good with that. Paulo Costa, he landed one and rocked him. He's very sneaky with his kicks. Jan Blachowicz' best skill for me is closing in the distance and then being able to land those massive hooks, which he knocked out Corey Anderson out cold with, and he knocked finished Dominic Reyes with, which was a very impressive win. I think Jan Blachowicz is definitely slept on, but it's the reason he's slept on is not because he's a bad fighter, but because of how good Israel Adesanya has looked. He's looked incredible. He's looked unbeatable at 185. But I completely agree with what Hunter said. The grappling would be huge. If Jan Blachowicz, and hopefully they're doing this, they need to be game planning for him to close, not necessarily shoot for takedowns, but just wear on Israel Adesanya in the clinch. The only fights he's really looked human in, Israel Adesanya, has been Kelvin Gastelum, wherever that was a very close fight, and Kelvin Gastelum was mixing in a lot of the grappling. Now, Israel Adesanya wasn't tired necessarily at the end, but he was not as fresh as he was at the beginning, and we've seen in other 5-round fights he can go all 5 rounds and be fine. But if you mix in the grappling, it is interesting. And Kelvin Gastelum's a very small middleweight. He was a big welterweight, very small middleweight. Jan is a big light heavyweight, and if he could just mix in some of the clinch, just wear on him a little bit, could be interesting. And also breaking off the clinch, if you can land a hook or something, it's interesting. So basically, at the end of the day, it's as simple as Jan needs to close the distance, mix in the wrestling. Israel Adesanya needs to keep the distance and just do what he does. I don't even really need to say that much about Israel Adesanya because you already know how good he is and why he is the favorite in this fight. So that's kind of my take on it. And what we all kind of said was close for Jan, keep for Israel Adesanya.
Yeah, excellent. I totally agree with both of you. And I actually like the point Hunter alludes to there just a minute ago. You know, Jan Blachowicz has built his career on his game being underestimated and underappreciated.
Yeah.
And I do want to make clear, Adesanya can't get emotional and try and stand and trade to prove a point, because 20 pounds in difference is a world of difference, not just in boxing or in MMA, but in any combat sport there is. If he stands there and tries to trade to prove some sort of point, he will get knocked out. Be under no illusion. Bigger fighters like Dominic Reyes and Anderson and Rockhold have found that out the hard way with broken jaws and such. And I actually love the point you make too, Jack, and I will allude to it briefly before we move on. You know, Adesanya has faced two good wrestlers at middleweight, and one he's dominated and one he's struggled with. Derek Brunson, he made look amateurish just because his takedown defense was so good and he was able to counter strike and manage the distance. Kelvin Gastelum was a nightmare for Adesanya. And I don't want to say it's down to ego, because I don't think Adesanya is arrogant when it comes to his business in the cage. But for a small middleweight to do that to Adesanya is going to give hope to anybody with a wrestling background against him. And, you know, I know you said Adesanya didn't look great after the fight. Adesanya looked beat up and quite badly too. You know, Gastelum ran in bravely to close the distance, but his wrestling worked. He did get him up against the cage and he landed decent shots. If Gastelum had a better gas tank, he arguably at times could have finished that fight. So Adesanya's just got to be conscious and aware of his own weaknesses, build on them, and he will become a much better fighter. But, you know, as Hunter said there a minute ago too, Adesanya's prone to being emotional in fights and going in there trying to prove something he doesn't need to. He needs to keep this on the outside and not try and mix it up with Jan.
Right. No, I agree. And one more thing I'd like to just mention here. We take a look at Izzy's closest fights. One of them I'd love to mention is Marvin Vettori. Take a look at Marvin Vettori and we take a look at Jan Blachowicz. They seem like pretty similar fighters to me. I feel like Marvin Vettori, where he gave Izzy trouble, Jan can do the exact same thing. And especially since Jan is just a lot more, I feel like, experienced fighter and more of a veteran than Vettori at this point. I don't know the age difference here. I'm pretty sure Jan's 37 right now, 36.
I think he's one of those. Yeah.
I think, but he's had a long career in the UFC, and I feel like he can utilize what Marvin Vettori did a lot better than Marvin Vettori himself.
And that was a less experienced Vettori too.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Yes. And same could be said about Izzy. I think his debut, I believe. So.
Yeah. But that's a great comparison. I didn't even think about that. That is a perfect comparison. And let's go ahead and move on to our next segment here. And we have some great fan questions we will be answering. In fact, 3 for today. First one comes from not a follower or fan, but Mace Martinez, who would be joining us today, unfortunately cannot, but he has to be a part of it somehow, right? So his question is, who do we think will win? And just kind of talk about Islam Makhachev versus Drew Dober. Great and important fight at 155 on UFC 159. Keelan, what do you think about this one?
Yeah, first of all, shout out Mace. Thanks for the question, brother. Appreciate it. This is a great fight. This is a really slept-on fight. Islam Makhachev, all these Eastern guys, we know how good their wrestling is. Yep. I really don't think I need to expound on that much more than we already have. Makhachev is just rock solid everywhere, really. His wrestling, his fundamentals are damn near perfect. His striking is very, very decent. But he's coming up against a guy in Drew Dober who, to me, almost looks like he's had a resurgence in form. He looks like not that his head was ever in a bad place, but he looks like he's refreshed and like he's much more ready to go. So I think this is going to be a really good fight, and I think this is a fight people should be watching because this, I think, will have quite large implications for the top 10 of lightweight, depending on what way this goes. I have Makachev winning by a late stoppage or a decision just because he's got that stamina ground into him. And I think he'll end up pushing Drew Dober against the cage, doing damage, and eventually wearing him out. That's not a knock on Drew Dober. You know, guys like Makachev are just really, really tough. They're nightmare opponents for anyone in their division. So I think Makachev's going to make a bit of a statement. I think he's going to end up getting a late stoppage or very possibly unanimous decision. And I think he's going to make a statement here.
Yeah, Hunter, what do you think?
I agree mostly. I just think I think it's going to be going to unanimous decision almost no matter what. I think Drew Dober, I don't want to sleep on him or anything like that. He's had some fantastic knockouts, total resurgence of his, like, he just looks like a whole fresh and different fighter than he used to. But I feel like Islam's going to use his ground game to really prove and keep him against the fence and even just on the ground, flattened out, and just continue that ground and pound we've seen in the past. And I feel like Drew Dober's tough enough to take that ground and pound and maybe scramble a little bit and maybe get back to his feet every now and then. But Islam's just going to take him down and drag him to the end of the pool and make him really drown in this fight. I feel like Islam Makhachev is looking really sharp in all aspects of his fighting. You know, his knockout power is fantastic. His ground game is parallel to Khabib at this point. We're seeing amazing things out of this fighter, and I feel like Islam has every tool to use it. So I say unanimous decision by Makhachev.
Yeah, that's the perfect assessment for me. That was amazing. He is so good on the ground. Obviously, he's training with the best. He's grown up with the best. He's going to be one of the best on the ground. He just keeps rounding out his game. He hasn't fought in a little bit, but obviously being 18-1 in his MMA career. The one thing I will say that's interesting though about this fight, he was going to fight RDA and some higher level opponents. Obviously, none of that worked out, and he kind of has taken this fight just to get back into the flow of things because he hasn't fought in a long time. If he's looking at Drew Dober and is thinking, okay, it's just Drew Dober, I should be fighting higher opponents, that could be interesting because you cannot sleep on anybody in the UFC, especially a guy like Drew Dober who's on a winning streak right now and has looked fantastic. So the thing that's interesting for me is how he handles coming back into the UFC, but also at the end of the day, he looks just so good, and he looks like one of the brightest prospects in the UFC. So Hunter's assessment, I'm going to go with that. It's just that's the perfect way to say it. I could see him getting a late TKO in the end. I don't see Drew Dober getting knocked out or I guess maybe choked out, but his ground game is pretty good as well. But I pretty much agree with that. It just the grappling from Islam Makhachev is next level, and very few people could deal with it. So yeah, I'm gonna go with what Hunter said. Unanimous decision from Islam Makhachev is my prediction as well.
Yep, I fully agree. That's totally fair. We're all thinking along the same lines here, I think.
Yes. Yes.
The interesting dynamic for Makhachev that you alluded to, Jack, and I will expound on slightly, is as you just said, Makhachev has not fought in a while, and as we've seen from the Performance Center, the Apex, having no fans in there is having quite a big impact on a few fighters, I think. You know, a lot of guys are used to getting momentum in their fights and the crowds sort of pushing them to the end. There is none of that here. So I'm not saying that's going to enormously impact Makhachev because I think his skills are more than good enough. But we've seen this happen to bigger fighters. You know, I think the lack of crowds not giving a lot of fighters the push-up they need if something doesn't go their way. So to see him respond to the new atmosphere and obviously getting rid of Octagon Rust is certainly going to be an interesting aspect. You know, our assessment is not a knock on Drew Dober whatsoever. It's just a testament to how good of a prospect Islam Makhachev is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely.
No, and we've seen like Drew Dober has been he has decent ground game, but I mean, when we look at his losses, they've all come from basically submission and decision. Like, he doesn't really get knocked out too often, but we've seen him get submitted by Beneil Dariush. We saw him get submitted back in 2016, I want to say.
Yeah, I think that was it.
Yeah.
But yeah, we've seen some trouble in the ground for Drew Dober. I mean, we've all seen his stand-up game. It's fantastic. He's knocking everyone out, and he looks like almost like Michael Chandler in a way when it comes to his stand-up. But when it comes to his ground game, he is not necessarily Michael Chandler. I feel like he struggles on the ground sometimes, and he's gotten submitted in the past, and I could actually see this getting submitted. I mean, I would say accurately, I'd say unanimous decision, but I also see a submission happening maybe in the second or third round.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so for our next fan question, this comes from actually, I can't pronounce the last part, I apologize, but we will tag you so you will get to see it. A great question here, and this is a bit of a scenario. So, assuming Israel Adesanya beats Jan Blachowicz at UFC 259 and Stipe retains his belt against Francis Ngannou at 260, who would you like to see Jon Jones fight next, Stipe or Israel Adesanya? Keelan, what are you thinking?
Man, actually, thank you for the question. That's kind of the dream scenario for all us fans at the moment, and my head's completely gone thinking about this. Man, if I'm Jon Jones, who do I take out of that? Personally, I'm leaning towards Izzy, and I'm leaning towards Izzy for a couple of reasons over Stipe. It's not that Stipe is in any way any easier of a fight, because in many ways he's a harder fight. I think the first thing is, especially for the UFC, the bad blood makes it make sense. You know, Dana loves a good storyline. He's practically like WWE with these storylines now. You know, the back and forth, they've said they wanted to fight each other at some point, and I do think they will at some point, and it would sell millions and millions of pay-per-views. You know, the GOAT of light heavyweight against a potential GOAT of light heavyweight, a potential GOAT of middleweight. The story kind of writes itself. Skill-wise, there's very little to separate them. The only real disadvantage Adesanya might have is on the ground, because Jones's ground game's so underrated. Anybody who hasn't seen Jon Jones on the ground, watch the second Alexander Gustafsson fight. And that was just some of the cleanest transitions I've ever seen from Jones, much less anybody else. So if I'm Jon Jones, Adesanya makes more sense at the moment. You know, his body's completely acclimatized to 205. You know, he doesn't need any better motivation than Adesanya to get back to old Jon Jones too. You know, he's never had an opponent come at him aside from maybe DC the way Adesanya is now too. So he probably feels like he has a point to prove for the first time in a few years as well. So if I'm Jones, in terms of the personal feeling and probably the fighting chances too, Adesanya makes a lot of sense. But then, of course, with Stipe, champ, if Jones was able to beat Stipe and beat him convincingly, I do think this makes Jones the greatest of all time. I really, really do. He's sort of tantalizingly close to securing GOAT status, and especially against the greatest heavyweight of all time, it only adds to the argument in his favor. So, assuming everything plays out the way that we think it will, Jon Jones has got a real decision to make. I think in terms of practicality and what actually will happen, I think Stipe will happen just because he's already at 240 right now. But if Jones was still at 205 and hadn't begun the transformation, I think we'd be seeing Adesanya in the works right now instead.
Gotcha.
But a great question. Thank you for that, actually. That's a great question.
Yeah, no, I agree it's a great question, but I think I would much rather see, if I was in Jon Jones' position, I would much rather go to Stipe for the reasons that you said. This would make him unquestionably one of the greatest fighters of all time, if not the greatest fighter of all time. We take a look at, for the greatest of all fighters of all time, we take a look at George St. Pierre. We take a look at Conor McGregor in a lot of pictures. We take a look at Anderson Silva. And what do a lot of those fighters have in common? 2 belts. I mean, we take a look at George St. Pierre. He was welterweight, moved up to middleweight, got both belts there. I mean, he wasn't simultaneously the champion in both, but still he had 2 belts. We take a look at Randy Couture. We see light heavyweight and heavyweight, one of the greatest fighters of all time back in the day. And Jon Jones, it goes unquestionable if he gets his heavyweight belt here. I feel like really feeling disappointed lately because everyone's sleeping on him because of the work that Khabib's been doing. Like he's number 2 pound for pound lately because Khabib's still number 1. If he gets this second belt here, he is unquestionably the pound for pound champion in this division, or in all divisions, and maybe even of all time. He's been having a lot of trouble, I feel like, down at light heavyweight recently too. With against Thiago Santos, that fight was extremely close. Dominic Reyes, that fight
Yep.
was extremely close. I just feel like it would be a lot of trouble for DC. I mean, not DC. John Jones to stay back down at light heavyweight. Um, but if he moves up to heavyweight, we don't know what to expect really. I mean, his ground game, like Keelan said, is fantastic. If we take a look at Lyoto Machida's fight too, like he got hurt in that fight,
Yeah.
and then when he guillotined him like that and threw him down to the ground, that was one of the like most jaw dropping submissions I've seen out of anyone, let alone John Jones.
That was nasty.
It was insane. But I think his wrestling could rival Stipe's wrestling quite a bit, and his stand up game I feel like might be a little bit better than Stipe's standing game too, because we've seen Stipe get knocked out by DC, and we've seen Stipe struggle in a stand up game against DC in the second fight as well. I feel like the third fight was a little bit more clean for Stipe, but I mean, we've seen John Jones fight DC, and his stand up is damn near perfect. You know, we see very little holes in his game. And I feel like he's going to give Stipe a lot of trouble. If he were to fight Israel Ansai, on the other hand, I feel like Izzy would give John Jones a lot of trouble with all the different weapons and tools he has and in his arsenal and whatnot, all the spinning attacks, all the regular side kicks and kicks to the head and question mark kicks. That question mark kick from Izzy is insane too. We've seen it knock out plenty of people, even in his regular kickboxing career. He has, I think, like over 10 or 20 knockouts just from the question mark kick. But honestly, I'd say John Jones moving up to heavyweight, I feel like would work out better for him, and he would also get paid more money, which he would, I think, would want the most.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with three perspectives here. If I'm John Jones, let's start with that. I'm gonna go John Jones, what I want to see and what the UFC probably wants to happen. All right, this is just kind of what I'm thinking. If I'm John Jones, I actually kind of disagree with you there. I think the easier fight would be to go back down and fight Israel Adesanya. And that's not because Israel Adesanya is necessarily a worse fighter than Stipe, but just because it's his natural weight class. He knows the range, and he really Israel Adesanya has struggled a little bit whenever a person is able to grapple with him, and John Jones has the striking to back up the grappling, which I think could really pose a difficult matchup to Israel Adesanya. I think a lot of people would say, I wouldn't necessarily say this, but one of the reasons he was so lackluster against Dominic Reyes, Thiago Santos, was because he wasn't 100% focused on those fighters because they're not the biggest name fighters, especially not whenever they were fighting him. He would be 100% ready to go for Israel Adesanya. And then as opposed to going up against Stipe, whole nother weight class, something that's very interesting, and we kind of said this about Israel Adesanya going up to 205. 205 to heavyweight is a whole nother power level. No one hits like heavyweights. And Stipe has got some power. He's dropped a lot of people. He's been in some wars. He can take a shot as well. That's something he's going to have to deal with. And also the grappling aspect. Yes, John Jones is one of the most underrated grapplers in the UFC. Stipe was on a competitive level grappling with DC, and DC is an Olympic wrestler. And he has the striking to back it up. That's a really interesting fight for me. Stipe, John Jones, obviously Adesanya as well. That's dangerous. If I'm John Jones, though, you have to go up to 265 to heavyweight because you want to be the greatest of all time. If you go back down and beat Israel Adesanya, great, but you didn't do that one extra step, which was go up in a weight class and win. That being said, I think he would make more money with the Israel Adesanya fight just because Stipe is not a trash talker that much. But Israel Adesanya and John Jones, the whole media tour for that fight would be unbelievable, and I think that would get a little bit more pay-per-view buys. That being said, not that Stipe wouldn't. My perspective, I would love to see Stipe versus John Jones because of the reasons I just mentioned. I'd love to see John Jones go up and face a guy that is not only his size, but probably a little bit bigger than him, more power. That would really prove to me, if he wins that, I think he's probably the greatest of all time, and I think it'd be hard to make a case against that. Right now, I stand on the perspective of George St. Pierre just because he didn't fight for 3 years and came back and just beat Michael Bisping in the most dominant fashion ever and was one of the most dominant 170 champions of all time. But that being said, John Jones, if he does that, I can't argue against it. And I'd love to see it. I love Stipe. That would just be a great fight. And then after that, you could go down to fight Israel Adesanya, or Israel Adesanya could go up to heavyweight. Who knows? There's endless possibilities with that. And for the UFC, this is a bit stupid, but who cares? Like either way, you're getting a big payday. You're getting lots of eyes on the sport. Really, you can't go wrong with those two divisions right now. The biggest takeaway from this fight, and a great question, is just there's a lot of exciting possibilities, and either way you go, you're going to get a great fight, and you're going to get some very exciting stuff from John Jones, Stipe, or Adesanya.
Yeah, UFC 259 and UFC 260 is going to clear a lot of smoke for both title pictures. Yeah. Be under no illusion, regardless of what way the dice rolls out here. You know, John Jones is in a very, very good position. If he goes back down eventually and beats Adesanya, he's the GOAT of GOATs at light heavyweight, and there is no dispute anymore. If he goes up to heavyweight and beats Stipe and has the talent to wipe out the division, then he could be the GOAT at heavyweight too, which is a really scary thought. You know, this is just such an interesting dynamic. You know, you can break down light heavyweight, you can break down heavyweight too. You know, if Jones decides to go back down to 205 to hunt Adesanya, he's the toughest test Adesanya will ever have. Beyond no doubt, he just will be. Adesanya's fight against Blachowicz will tell us a lot about how Adesanya would face against Jones, because he's I don't think he's facing a fighter as talented as Jones. Not a knock on Blachowicz, but it's going to tell us a lot about how Adesanya fills out at 205. But Adesanya should not go anywhere near heavyweight. As Jack said, a heavyweight hits different. Jabs will knock you out. Volkov practically knocked over him out with a jab. What would he do to a middleweight? You know, you do have to consider these things. But I think John Jones is the X factor to heavyweight, what Adesanya is to light heavyweight. Because we haven't seen them in a warm-up fight or anything like that, we don't know what they're going to bring going up in weight. Some fighters have thrived going up in weight. Some guys have really struggled going up in weight. If Jones fights Stipe, there's a lot of dynamics that actually work in his favor. Number one, the oblique kicks. Stipe, I don't think, has ever actually faced many oblique kicks in his career. Jones is going to manage distance with those and chop at Stipe's base to try and knock him out that way, as well as obviously using his kicks and his hands up top. And what you also have to remember with Jones is the likes of the spinning back elbow and the spinning back fist. Stipe has suffered with some pretty gruesome eye injuries following the eye pokes from Cormier. He might not see those strikes coming if they clinch too, because Jones moves quick and he will bring that speed up with him, I feel. But yeah, it's just an unbelievably interesting question. If we get both of those fights, then I think everybody's dream's complete. But this could work out really, really well for John Jones, and it could work out brilliantly for Adesanya too. Personally, based on history, I'm going to hedge my bets on John Jones. I think, you know, he's a man that rises to the occasion. He always has. With the Thiago Santos and Dominic Reyes fights, I fully agree with Jack. I think he got to the point where he returned that because they weren't big enough names, he felt like almost a Kamaru Usman in the 30% comments, that he could just cruise through its second gear and he wouldn't take any damage. And I think now he's realized, obviously, that's not the case. The funny thing is, even though he hates DC, guys like John Jones need guys like Daniel Cormier, because they push each other and they make each other better. And that could be the same with Adesanya. Who knows? If he goes down, he goes back down to 205 and fights Adesanya, we could see something like that. So I'm just so interested to see what the next year brings with Jones, Adesanya, and Miocic, because one way or another, it's going to be a hell of a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, I agree. I also agree with the part that bad blood sells. You know, I mean, that John Jones versus Adesanya fight, the press conference and everything like that, that would be amazing. Amazing to watch. The Stipe John Jones one also wouldn't be horrible, I feel like. I mean, crowning the baddest man alive on the planet, you know, that's also not a bad sell, you know. This would solidify John Jones' position if he were to go up to heavyweight and win. I feel like there's, once again, like Jack said, there's just like no dispute whether or not he's the GOAT. He would be the GOAT. I feel like he's already in talks of being the GOAT, and he's competed at was like heavyweight, and he's been champion forever. He hasn't really lost like to anyone, I'd say. I mean, there was a a botched like fight, early on in his career that could go either way.
God damn you.
No one mentions it, and we should not mention it at all. I feel like John Jones, I would say, has an undefeated record at this point going in, and both undefeated records, Anasaya versus John Jones, was also be a fantastic fight. This was honestly a fantastic question, but just for me, I feel like just to prove it one way or another, I would like him to go up to heavyweight to see if he truly is the best fighter of all time. I feel like if he were to defend his belt against Izzy, it would definitely motivate him and whatnot, and honestly improve his skills. But it's his home territory. He's used to that fight. Everyone's like, oh my God. I mean, like, he's used to that. Izzy's not used to that. There would be excuses flying all over the board. There would be no excuses if he went up to heavyweight, I feel like.
Yeah. Yep. Completely agree. All right. So lots of good stuff there. On to our last topic of the day. And this one comes from Mike Owens Media on Instagram. Shout out to him. Another fantastic question to close off the podcast. What is the best promotion outside the UFC and Bellator at the moment? Starting with Keelan, what are you thinking on this one?
Ooh, interesting question, Mike Owens. Thank you for it. God, that's a really good question. Outside of One and Bellator, I must admit I am a fan of One Championship. I do like what they're doing. I think they're run by very, very smart, capable people. For example, whenever the Ben Askren Demetrius Johnson trade happened, I was stunned because One are getting an A plus player for, with the greatest of respect to Ben Askren, a C player, and posterity proved that we were right in that.
Yep.
So I'm a big fan of what One Championship are doing. And not only are they a stellar mixed martial arts organization, they have a kickboxing division. They're very diverse in the fights that they run. That, they have a very diverse roster. They've got guys from Thailand. They've got guys like Sage Northcutt, who we discussed on the last episode. They're a very, very well-run organization, and I'm a big fan of what they're about. I obviously in the UK, geographic UK here, Cage Warriors are very big. They're a very decent outfit too. Conor McGregor is probably the biggest expat to come from Cage Warriors, but they've got really, really good guys there too. Like Paddy Pimblett's very well known, really, really good featherweight. So there are a lot of promotions out there that are very well run. For my money, just to answer Mike's question, my favorite's One Championship outside of Bellator and the UFC. I just think they're run so well, and they always put on a hell of a show. And they've got great people like Misha Tate advising them in the background on what to go and how to break into markets. So I'm a big One guy. I'm a fan of what they're about.
Yeah, no, I like One a lot too. They, you don't see a whole lot of mistakes from them. They look really professional and whatnot and everything like that. But still, I think what I would like to say is Cage Warriors. Cage Warriors always knows how to put on a show.
Yeah.
You see fantastic fighters coming from that. I like you said, Conor McGregor, but we've also seen fighters like Michael Bisping, Bigfoot Silva, a lot of fantastic fighters that go under the radar and they're just from Cage Warriors. I feel like Cage Warriors is definitely a great breeding ground for Bellator and UFC. And honestly, I'm most entertained by Cage Warriors because, I mean, sure, these guys don't always have like the best talent and they're not like at their peak of their career yet, but you just see like raw strength and raw entertainment coming from that. And that's what I like to see when I watch a fight. I want to see entertainment, and technicality and technical ability is fantastic. And it's always like great to see, but Cage Warriors is where you see like raw, you see people swinging, you see people just trying to get down and dirty. You see these slams happening that you wouldn't see in the UFC. I'd say my money goes to Cage Warriors.
Yeah, I like that. You also get to see fighters develop. It's really early in their careers. You see them develop. For me, the big three is UFC, Bellator, and One Championship. So I'm going to go with One Championship as my other one. And this is a bit of a hot take, maybe, but I almost prefer watching One Championship over Bellator. Bellator, they have the bigger names, and I think their championship fights are better on the top half of their divisions, but top to bottom fight cards, prelims and everything, and mixing in the kickboxing in as well, I like that a lot. I kind of prefer watching One Championship. The quality of the fights are so good. They don't have the biggest names because they're based in Singapore, but they have some very good guys over there. The shows are great. their vice president of something. Obviously, you said Misha Tate, Rich Franklin, who is one of my favorite fighters growing up, one of the founders of the UFC. I love watching him, and he is one of the guys that's up there making it happen, and why it is such a great event every single time they do it. They have a great fan base over there, and I like every show. Even their commentary is not that bad. Although it's hard to beat Big John and Goldberg over in Bellator. I love that whole merge over. We were talking about Mike Goldberg the other day. Anyways,
Shut up, Mike.
yes, absolute legend. So I don't know. One championship is so good. Cage Warriors is amazing, and I will just shout out another one. LFA. I know Chris De Santiago, the creator of MMA Island. The reason we're all here, we just had him on the podcast a couple of days ago. He covers LFA a lot. They have some great fights. They had a fight of the year contender the other last year. So they put on some good shows as well. Cage Warriors, like Hunter said, like Keelan said, they put on just raw ability, and you just see some crazy stuff happening. But from a super established organization, top to bottom, I'd say one championship with the talent they have, and every single fight is at least decent and high quality. I'd say one championship is my vote for the best promotion outside the UFC and Bellator.
Yeah, and just to add a different dynamic to Mike Owens' question, just for the interest, if we're talking historical promotions too that are no longer with us, definitely Strikeforce and Pride in there also.
Yes.
You know, we all grew up on those two.
We love the Grand Prix,
no really fond memories.
Soccer kicks, foot stomp, yeah.
Yeah.
Right leg hospital, left leg cemetery.
Pro Cup. So good. Yeah, no, I mean, I also like to mention PFL. PFL is fantastic.
That's true.
They're getting some really good fighters down there too. I think is it Anthony Pettis is going to PFL now?
Yep.
Which is a lightweight tournament, I think.
Yeah. So it's just they're doing great stuff down there. I feel like they're a little earlier on in their career though to really develop like all the other fighting organizations and whatnot. But I feel like in 10 years from now, they're going to be a really big top dog organization.
They have Rory McDonald too, I think.
Yeah,
they do. And just to shout out their predecessor, what they used to be was the World Series of Fighting on NBC, and that was where Justin Gaethje was developed and came into the UFC. They're a big spot in MMA as well. Yeah,
definitely.
All right, guys. Well, this was a great podcast. Some great fan questions there at the end. Terrible breaking news at the start, but overall, great podcast. We pieced it together. Thank you, Hunter, so much for coming on. Make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube. You can listen everywhere, iTunes, Spotify, anywhere you can listen to a podcast. We are there. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at MMA Island and check out Hunter's work, all of our work on the website, MMAisland.net. Again, Hunter, thank you so much for joining us today, and great podcast, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Hunter, for being on. It's a pleasure, man.
Thank you very much. Glad to be on.